Hi, Hetal. How are you?
I am so good. Christy, I'm so excited. I don't even know, should I talk about how serendipitous it
Yes,
Okay.
please do. Let's talk about how you got here today.
So it was so serendipitous for me because can sorry.
It's okay.
The podcast studio, can we say we're in a podcast studio
Yep.
and all of that stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it was super serendipitous for me to, first of all, be here because last week I actually booked a tour for the podcast studio that we're in right now.
I love it.
I'm so floored because then 2 days later, pretty sure, Christy, you reached out to me just a couple of days after that saying, hey, let's do an interview at this podcast studio. I'm like, okay, there's something in the air right now. So I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
You are so welcome, and I am equally as excited to have you here. And I do think it's wild the way this came together because we had connected on LinkedIn over a year ago, probably.
Yeah.
Or about a year ago.
Yep. And we've been trying to get in contact and get in touch and have a coffee, but
it just hasn't worked out. And then I had a guest spot available. I knew you lived in the area. I thought, let me just ask her. I'd love to have her on. And I just can't get over the fact that you were like, actually, I'm going to tour that same podcast studio this week. So she actually came and saw the podcast studio right before our conversation. It's just crazy.
So funny. So funny.
But so anyway, I'm so happy to have you here and really happy to have this conversation with you. I was telling you before we started recording that these are the conversations that I really love to have, to hear somebody's full story of, just kind of the adversity you've been through, the challenges that you've overcome, and ultimately how you're really working towards living out your passion and your purpose. And at the end of the day, this podcast really is about passion, compassion, community, and I think really my greatest hope for this podcast has always been to connect people with stories and ideas and living proof that you can and should follow your passion, follow your heart, especially when it involves wanting to make an impact in a positive way. And that really is what your story is all about. So let's start by, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born and raised, how you grew up, and what led you to choose to study engineering in college?
Oh, man. So I was born in New York, in Queens, New York. My parents actually came from India. So 1988 was when my parents came over. And, born in Queens, my dad was the second youngest of 7 kids. Insane, big family. So grew up about 45 minutes north of New York City in Rockland County. And my whole family, almost all of my cousins, they're all in the medical field. And so I had always thought, okay, what are my options? What kind of doctor do I want to be? That was the question I would ask. And I remember I loved working with kids. I loved being around, my cousins who were, within that kind of field, like the pediatrician, natology, all of that. So I was always thinking, okay, I'm going to become maybe a pediatrician. But I never opened up my horizons. I never had somebody say, oh, there's maybe something more than just being a doctor. And so I grew up, same line of thought, I'm going to do this. And then right before college, I had this feeling inside of me where I was like, you know what? I don't know if medical school is going to happen for me. So then I did this thing where I thought out logically, if I don't go to medical school, what is a good fallback career to have? And so I thought biomedical engineering. I still wanted to be in the healthcare field, but what was something else that I could do where I wouldn't have to go and get a PhD per se to actually have a stable job? Biomedical engineering. I did not think about engineering before that. I had no idea how hard it would be. I basically I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, one of the best engineering schools in the States, and I studied engineering. Really difficult. Had to take some classes over again. Barely made a 3.0 GPA. I did it. But it was hard. And I remember throughout college, my sophomore year, I had this like crisis where, you know, I was like, okay, I don't think medical school is going to happen. And I was like, do I continue on with engineering? Do I change my major? I don't know. And I felt like I didn't have enough preparation that I just continued on. And so I fought through, studied engineering, graduated, thankfully, got a job right in New Jersey, got a job in New Jersey, did that for a year and a half. Then I just decided, okay, well, what's the next best step? Get a master's. And then I got my master's, thankfully, at Columbia University. Then I moved on and I just kept going. Like, it was almost like I was on autopilot, you know? And for me, it was always about like proving to my family that I could be successful within the engineering field, because I wasn't going the way that they wanted me to do. You know, they wanted me to go to medical school route, and they were like, you know what? We don't really know how engineering works, you know?
Right. So you felt you constantly had something that was probably what was motivating you through it. It's like, I have something to prove.
Right. Exactly. And then the moment that I didn't have anything else to prove was when I was like, okay, well, what am I doing this for?
Mm. And is that when, so I know, kind of just reading through your story, that there was, you know, yes, like all these goals you were achieving that were really significant. And I do want to say totally kudos for working through all of that, because this isn't like you just chose some easy path and,
Right.
you know, you weren't just trying to prove yourself with like an easy, you know, course of study. You chose a really hard course of study,
Right.
and then continued, like you said, to get your master's. And I can see how that was all sort of motivating you forward, was this desire to prove yourself. But then when you say you hit this point where you're like, I have nothing left to prove, is that when you started to struggle with anxiety and depression?
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, I got to the point where, hey, I got my engineering degree. I got my master's degree from an Ivy League school, right? That's something that, you know, I think if anyone who's South Asian or Asian is listening in, like you know that once your parents are boasting about you, right, to all of their friends, you kind of made it, right? So my mom was saying, hey, my daughter went to Columbia University. Hey, my daughter is working for the top healthcare company, you know, Johnson and Johnson. She's doing this, she's doing that. And so once I had my family, I saw that my family was visibly proud of me. I think at that moment I was like, okay, now what do I do this for?
What's my why?
What is my why? Exactly. And that is when I started to question my path, because at that point, as an engineer, you know, when you're working for a medical device company, you kind of have a specific path laid out for you. You're an engineer, then you're a senior engineer, then you're a staff engineer, then you're a principal, then you might be a manager, then you might be a director, right? And when I started to look at that path and look at people who are above me, I asked myself, do I want to do that?
Yeah.
Like, do I want to be a director of this company? Do I want to, you know, move up this ladder? And I feel like the answer for me was always not really, you know? And so what happened was I started to feel a little stuck, and then I wanted to just move out of what I was doing. And I moved out from R&D. Then I ultimately landed in sales, because So I was like, well, maybe it's not the engineering part. Maybe it's just my environment. Maybe it's because I'm sitting in a cube all day. Maybe I can find a role where I'm meeting people. I love connecting with people. I love networking with people. And maybe there's a role where I can do that, and maybe I can flourish in that. So I went from R&D to sales. I went from working in orthopedics to working in cardiovascular. So I went from having a 10-minute commute to having a 2-hour commute or an hour and a half commute, going from Westchester all the way down to Baltimore almost every single day.
Wow.
Yeah, to assist physicians in their electrophysiology, cardiac ablation procedures. So essentially what that is when somebody has AFib or a flutter in their heart, it's an electrical pathway that is uncontrollable. That's what happens where you feel a palpitation in your chest. And so patients will get, a procedure to have a therapy to remove that, that palpitation, or that electrical system that's happening. And I found myself, doing that commute every day, working with physicians. Literally, some of these procedures would last 6 to 7 hours, where you're sitting you're sitting in front of a computer with a patient on the table. You can't even go to the bathroom because
Wow.
this is crazy.
That's intense.
It was stressful in the fact that, you're working with different personality types in terms of doctors. You're also working with nurses and techs, and you have to be able to meld yourself, in that environment. And that was something that was really rough for me, because for me, if I'm not being myself, I feel also drained, because you have to, it's almost like a personality. You're code switching from one hospital to another hospital, to one physician to another physician. So I found out that I was like, I can't, this is something that I don't really like. If I can't be authentically like myself, then that's not going to work out. The drive.
Terrible.
Couldn't do 3 hours a day in the car. Yeah.
And I feel like what I love about the thread throughout your story here is that you really have been continually checking in with yourself, assessing what felt authentic and true and what didn't. And even though you were working hard to meet the standards or expectations of your family or others in your life, you still kind of kept having this internal check-in of, well, this doesn't feel right though. And I commend you for trying to pivot and try new things. But when was the moment when you ultimately realized, okay, I have to be completely honest with myself here, that this isn't for me? I mean, I know that, let's talk a little bit about, you launched your podcast initially in 2020.
Right.
Tell us about that first. And I think it was at that time, right, where you had started this new role.
Right.
And sort of, you hit a major breakdown point. So tell us about when this all sort of came to be.
Yeah. The podcast, it's interesting because when I talk about my story, sometimes they like glaze over the first launch of the podcast. I actually started going on service trips in 2015, 2016. So the first service trip that I went on was to India. And I was, my eyes were so like opened. I know that my parents came from there. But to go to a place where I know my parents grew up and then see the dichotomy of poor and rich was really eye-opening to me. I worked in a slum school for 3 weeks. And then since then, I started looking for opportunities to, maybe volunteer more, go abroad more, just travel to see how people lived, in other places. And that's kind of what brought about the first launch of the podcast, where I just started having conversations. I started reaching out to people and saying, hey, like, I really love what you're doing in Haiti or India or wherever. Can we have a conversation? I just want to know more. And then I realized, hey, let's just hit record. Let's just hit record and then we'll see what we do with it after. I remember having a conversation with Callie Himsel from La Pointe Foundation. And this was back in 2019, 2020. And I thought I was going to write a blog from our conversation. And then after hitting record and all of that, my conversation stayed in my laptop for 3 months. I think it was 3 months before I decided to do a podcast. And I was like, oh, let's just make this the first episode. So that's how it happened. The first launch of the podcast. And it just, after that, I was like, okay, let's keep it going. But at the same time, I was working at J&J, and I didn't realize that with the podcast, I didn't realize how much work a podcast would be. With the marketing, with the editing, with the just booking guests and, trying to work around their schedules and all of that. There's a lot of work.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. And then when you're working at a job that requires you to drive and, be on at all times, like you cannot slack off when you're in a procedure room in a hospital, because that means something for the person that's on the table, right? And a lot of my energy just started, I just felt myself draining more and more and more. And I realized sometime in 2021, I couldn't go on with the podcast. And so I put that to the side. And then I continued on with my job. And I just realized, I needed to take matters into my own hands at some point. There's only so much you can ask your managers to do. There's only so much you can ask for help. This reminds me of a funny time in college. My first year of college, I played tennis on the team. And there was a lot of stuff I did my first year. I was on the dance team, played tennis, met my first very serious boyfriend. And I remember my grades were just tanking. And I was like, okay, I need to quit the tennis team because I need to focus on school. And I remember talking to my coach. I said, I think I'm going to need to quit. And she goes, well, is there anything else we can do for you? I'm like, are you going to take my exams for me? Because I can't do this anymore, because practice every day and then, going out for games and all of that, for matches. And so that's exactly kind of what happened with my job at that time, where I was asking my managers, hey, this is how I'm feeling right now. I'm not mentally well. I am not taking care of myself, physically. There's only so many podcasts I can listen to in the car while driving because it was just so overstimulating at a point. And I found myself waiting for days, or we call them admin days, where we don't have to go to a hospital. We just stay at home and just do some paperwork or other things for work. And I was waiting. I would just be so excited when I would get the call and say, hey, you can stay home tomorrow, and I was just so, I felt myself just my personality was just not there anymore. I was almost like a shell of a human. Okay, tomorrow I got to get up at 5:00 in the morning. I got to leave. I have this 2-hour drive going down to the children's hospital. Okay. Don't get back home until 7:00. Sometimes I'd have a night, a day bag. Because I tell myself, if I'm down there after 6 p.m., there's no point in coming back home because I'd have to drive back in the morning. The only comfort is I'm sleeping in my own bed.
Yeah.
Right. So I'd have to stay in hotels all the time. But I just remember in December, I was on an admin day, and then that day around like 2 or 3 o'clock, I was coming back home from the grocery store, and my coworker texted me and he said, "Hey, I'm so sorry. We're going to need you at the Children's Hospital in DC." And that's even further down from like Baltimore. And I just felt myself like I had a panic attack.
Yeah.
I was in my car and I was like panicking. And I remember texting my therapist and I said, "Can we just talk right now? Because I can't. I'm not here mentally right now. And I just heard that I need to go down to the Children's Hospital tomorrow." So, we got on a call. I got on a call with my therapist, and she said, "This is not sustainable. You can't do this for many more months to come." So I agreed. And then I think it was a couple days later that I had a meeting with my manager. And this is another thing I like to tell people. I'm like, nobody teaches you how to quit a job. Like nobody says, "Here's the guideline of, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3. I found myself running around a bush, trying to tell him that I didn't want to work for this company anymore. And I know he was saying things like, you could take a vacation. Okay, well, 3 or 4 days is not going to cut it, because then I'm going to have the anxiety of coming back to work.
Yeah. Like you had already made your mind up, but it was just a matter of navigating finalizing it.
Right. And that's exactly what happened, where we finally came to the decision that, yeah, I'm putting in my 2 weeks notice. And the last day of December in 2021 was my last day. And I remember waking up January 1st being like, is this real life? I felt like David after dentist. Like, I was like, what is happening here? And, going back to the whole trying to prove, right? At that time, I think my family realized how much this job was really draining me, that they were okay with me leaving, and at this point, 2 years later, I think they've realized that they have to put trust in me, that I'm doing the right thing, and that I'm, I have the support system. And my fiance, they're a huge support system to me too. And I wouldn't be making these decisions if I didn't believe in where I was going. And yeah. But I remember 2 weeks after I quit, I started being like, oh, now I got to do this. Now I got to do that. Now I got to do this. And I remember my fiance was just like, you need to relax. Mm-hmm. You just quit a job that burned you out so much. You don't need to figure it out just yet.
Wow, that's powerful that he was able to say that for you, because I'm so in awe really of hearing your story, and again, all the different points where you really were just taking the right steps to get yourself to the right place mentally eventually. Like the fact that you had a therapist at that point, and you knew, I need to call the therapist and talk this through. That's huge that you had already been seeing somebody who could help you talk through that. Again, that your family knew enough to know you tried your best. You did, but this was burning you out. And I just give you so much credit for continuing to like dig and dig and dig till you got to the point where it was like, this is enough. This is what I need to do for myself. And also that you were surrounded by people who encouraged you and supported you, like your fiance, to say, no, pause. You absolutely, it's very hard. I think I'm the same way when you know that you need a break, but you're an ambitious person, or you're excited to create or do things or make opportunities for yourself. It's very hard to take a beat and really force yourself. But it sounds like that is what you did over the course then of 2022. You focused on recovery, spiritual growth, travel.
You don't know how much I meditated that year.
Oh, I believe it. I believe it, because that is what has gotten me through so much So many like personal
meditation,
hurdles.
yoga, everything. I'm like, okay, like the tarot cards, even the oracle card. I'm like,
Oh, I am right there with you. And the truth is, I think when you're battling something internally, like you're really trying to struggle through your own personal battle, like you said, there is only so much that other people can help you.
right.
And there comes this point where you have to take matters into your own hands and do this sort of introspective work. Like meditation is hugely beneficial for that. Just kind of quieting your mind and shutting out all the outside noise and all that expectation and all the striving you had done up to that point to prove yourself.
Right.
And I think it's incredible that you were able to have enough awareness and support in your life to know that you needed to take this time. So tell us about that time that you kind of took off through 2022 and what that looked like, but then how you relaunched the podcast. And I want to get into what is the podcast and what is it that you really focus on now, and how is it kind of that your travels and your experiences and all of those moments like you talked about in India where your eyes were open and your perspective shifted. How did that all lead you in this direction of wanting to do more social impact driven work?
I tried my hardest to just not do things. I think, being a woman, but then on top of that, being like a woman from a South Asian family that has had so much expectation put on top of her, especially being like on my mom's side, I'm the oldest cousin. So I'm the one where everybody looks up to, and it's hard to strip all of that away and just say, I am human. I went through this experience. And I'm right now, it's just a time for me to just step back, And thankfully I was privileged enough to like have the savings and have the support system and all of that to not need to, do so much at that point. And I think towards the end of 2022 was when I started to wonder, okay, like what is my next step? I'm not going to like make any drastic moves. I think I've learned my lesson from making very impulsive decisions in terms of work, or studying engineering was probably an impulsive decision because I never even thought about engineering before going to college. And then, taking that last job that I had with J&J was pretty impulsive on my end as well. And I remember I applied to that job, and 2 days later I got offered that job, and I accepted that offer.
And then you were off into this spiral of overwhelm.
Right. And my fiance would say, he's very grounding for me because he's almost like the opposite of me. He's like, very much a planner, a think it through type of thing. He says, okay, well, the next move that you do, let's just think it through, And I decided to hire a career coach. I'm going to shout her out, Dr. Jasmine Escalera. She's amazing. If you're a woman of color and you need help on your next career option, book her. She's amazing. Anyways, we worked together for, I think it was like 3 months. And it was just a lot of digging deep. And I just remember talking to her about, this podcast that I had in 2020, how I just felt so invigorated by learning. I have 2 engineering degrees. I never knew that one could study public health or global health or any of that kind of stuff. Or even like within the social impact. Like I didn't really name it social impact at that point. I just wanted to learn. And I think my travels to India, to Honduras, to El Salvador, to even, traveling for fun to Southeast Asia, I just started to have a curiosity of Wow. Okay. All of these people, you know, they all live differently, but the dichotomy between rich and poor, like for example, in India, like if you go to Bombay, there's buildings on one side of a road and then there's a wall on the other side of the road. And on the other side of the wall, you'll see slums.
Mm.
And the thing with me is like, for me, I'm like, why? Like, why is this the way that it is? Why do people have to live this way? And what are other people doing to serve them? You know, whether it be, whether it be the clear poverty that you're seeing, or, the how people are getting their nutrition, how are these kids that are living in these slums being educated, what are people doing, you know? Even within the US, I interviewed Dr. Neda Shtari. She did a lot of work in advocacy against big pharma, and that's something that we're affected by in the US, high drug prices. Why? Why is that the case? And I think these questions I just am so curious about what those answers are. And I don't have that background, right? And so I think with the podcast, it was just, being a beginner and learning alongside my audience and really not being afraid to ask those maybe stupid questions,
Yeah. I love that is your angle on the podcast, that really you're talking about these global health issues, but from a very easy to digest beginner type of mindset. And you say that this isn't a podcast where someone's lecturing you
Right.
about extremely sciencey and complicated
Right.
things, which can be boring and difficult to follow.
Right.
So tell us more about that approach, like your approach to this, and how you make these complex issues more easy to understand and relate to, and maybe then be inspired to take action towards.
Yeah. I tell my guests, like, I just want this to be a conversation. I like to first talk to my guests about their journey, because a lot of times there's always a event where it changes the trajectory of this person's life into the social impact realm, or there's a reason why they started this nonprofit, or there's a reason why they're a public health professor, or just digging into that story, because then that story becomes relatable, right? And then people are like, oh wow, like I can see why this person moved into this direction. And I think that, yeah, there are there are podcasts where they're geared towards people within the profession of public health, right? And so then you can go a little bit deeper in terms of the sciencey terms and all of that kind of stuff. But this podcast is more of a introductory level where if they want to learn more, right, they can go into that themselves, right?
You're just kind of piquing their interest.
Right.
And to your point about these podcasts being mainly in a space where people already know about it, then it also becomes a conversation it's very hard to come into and understand what they're talking about, because it's so over your head, really. Like, that's
Right.
how I feel. I don't have any sort of, I mean, at least you have the degrees you have behind you, right? You have what you've learned in school behind you, to maybe be able to interpret what they're talking about.
Yeah.
I would jump into something like that and be like, I would shut down immediately, because I'm like, I don't speak that language.
Right.
So I love that, but I do think it's still super important for us to be tapped into these public health issues, these
'Cause it
global
affects
issues.
all of us.
Exactly.
That's the thing. It affects all of us. And I mean, we know that there's conflicts happening all around the world, right? And I feel like a lot of times we're just like, oh, that doesn't affect us. But we don't realize that sometimes maybe even our tax dollars are paying for this. Maybe I don't know. It's I think to at least have the awareness of what is happening in other places of the world and even places within the US. You know, I've learned that even places in the US don't have access to clean water.
Mm-hmm. And people don't realize that.
We would not realize that.
And your guest, so you're interviewing people that are able to kind of highlight these issues that people would necessarily not, it wouldn't even be on their radar. Like that's not something I've really looked into or that's on my mind or in my realm of awareness. Is that really at the heart of your intention for the podcast too, is to just like softly introduce people to these issues and help pique their interest?
I think that is one part of it. You know, introduce these issues, but then also introduce ways that they can get involved, you know. And for example, you know, I had an episode very, very early on about pelvic floor therapy. And I didn't know that pelvic floor therapy was a thing, you know. And this is something that women all over the world might need, you know. Like, and it's just, I think that alongside the highlighting the nonprofits that are doing really good work, but then also giving the education of what's happening and like the definition. Like, for example, I just highlighted a couple nonprofits that work with obstetric fistula patients, like women all over the world who have obstetric fistula.
What is that?
So essentially obstetric fistula, and I have an episode that's called What is Obstetric Fistula?
So we can dive a little deeper.
Yeah. So obstetric fistula is essentially a birthing injury that women will have if they have obstructed labor that is prolonged. So essentially, if the baby is obstructed within the uterus and basically cannot come out, it's pushing on tissue. Either on the bladder side or on the rectal side. And so once that tissue, if the baby is pushing on that tissue for too long, then that tissue ends up not getting the oxygen it needs, and then the tissue dies. It creates a hole. So a fistula is essentially a hole. And if there's a hole between the vaginal canal and the rectal canal, or the canal where the bladder is and the vaginal canal, then you'll have incontinence. So essentially uncontrollable leaking of feces and urine.
Wow.
So imagine being a woman who, first of all, probably lost her kid, her child, throughout this obstructed labor, this prolonged labor, and then at the same time now has to live with incontinence, you know.
And may or may not have any support to help deal with that.
And a lot of times these women don't have the education of why this has happened, and the support of how do I get this fixed. A lot of these women think that they are cursed because they don't have the education of why this happened. Oh, I'm cursed. I lost my kid and now I'm uncontrollably leaking feces. And now my husband doesn't want to live with me. I can't be around other people because they think I smell. So these things, you know, apparently it was this was like a little fun fact that I learned. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Queens, New York, they were originally a fistula hospital back in the day. I don't exactly know the time period, but back in the day they were. And then they closed down and now they're a hotel because there was no more need for that because people started getting the help that they needed, right? But it still happens in other areas of the world, right? So these are the kind of things where in the US, if you say, oh, obstetric fistula, nobody knows what the hell you're talking about.
Because it's an issue that's addressed.
Right.
And able to be fixed and supported. But then you have women in other parts of the country, other parts of the world
Yeah.
who just do not have that level of support. And then
Right.
now that completely shifts the trajectory of their life,
Right.
can ruin their life.
Right. And so if you're somebody that's listening to the podcast and learning about obstetric fistula, and you're somebody who's passionate about women's health, this is something that you can get involved with. You can get involved with this by volunteering, by just donating your time, by all of that.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you that that's the formula you used for your interview process is very similar to mine too, where I think that there's so much value in getting to know somebody's story, even if what you're telling me doesn't seem at first like it would relate to
Right.
what we eventually end up talking about. There's so much that happens in that process of hearing your story that allows me as a listener to just relate to you.
Right.
So that then when you start talking about these public health issues and how you're really passionate about this global public health world, and that's what your podcast is all about, I'm way more invested in what you're telling me because I know all that you've been through to get here.
Right.
To really feel connected to your passion and your unique purpose for being here. And I too I try to get that process to happen with my listeners as well, because I think that we can all do something to make a difference in the world, and it doesn't have to be something grand, some big gesture. Actually, we're going to make a lot more change and sustainable change when we all decide what is the thing that either the talent that I have to offer,
Right.
the skill set I have to offer, or what am I passionate about making a difference in, and how can I show up and help in my own small way. And I really love that we have so much alignment and synergy in that mission. And I would imagine that a big part of your intent, is to find solutions for these global issues, right? Or to inspire listeners to take more action. So what is some advice you could offer on ways, expand a little bit more on ways that the average person could get more involved in social impact work?
I think the first step is just to educate yourself. Find something that you are really passionate about. Like, for example, for me, I know that I couldn't be someone who just sticks to one thing, and that's another reason why I started this podcast, because I was like, there's just so many things. There's so many people out there that are doing so many amazing things. I just want to highlight all of them.
We are so similar. It's crazy. I feel the same way.
I cannot just be in one little silo. So I'm the person that wants to connect and network and amplify voices, right? But if you're somebody who is super passionate about like education or women's health or something like that, and if you're listening to the podcast and you listen to a podcast on education or whatever, do yourself a favor and just dig deep a little bit, just dig a little bit more deeper into what is it about that. If you keep asking yourself, hey, I want to do something good for the world, but I don't really know what it is. Take 5 minutes out of your day and just, maybe do a quick Google search. Education nonprofits in my community or whatever, if you want to do a global outreach, right?
Start looking and learning.
Yeah. Just do a little bit. Maybe just like do a little bit of networking. Book a call with somebody. Like, it's just, I think people get really overwhelmed by the sheer amount of stuff that's happening, in the world, that they wonder, oh, well, there's so many things, like, I don't even know where I would start, and I think it's just all about taking that first action, because I've found with myself that, connecting with one person then leads them to connect me with another person, and then it just continues to happen. And even with the podcast, I connect with a guest who then is like, oh, you should interview this other person, or you should interview or meet this other person. And then it just starts happening, And if you set the intention to just learn more about whatever it is you want to learn more about, it's going to happen. Like the universe just automatically always aligns, for
Yes.
you in that sense.
Oh, I believe that 100%. I think that exactly what you're saying. It's just taking one step forward, doing a little introspection to figure out like what am I drawn to,
Yeah.
or what organizations are out there that I could possibly tap into, and then letting that natural process unfold, because it will once you take the first step.
Right.
And I too want to just kind of normalize the conversation of, or I should say shift the narrative, not normalize the conversation, shift the narrative around exactly what you were just saying, that people feel so overwhelmed by all the things that are going on in the world that are overwhelming.
Yeah. It is.
And
it really is.
it's very easy to say, like, I couldn't possibly do anything to change that. What could I do? So we just shut down and we decide to do nothing.
Yeah.
But the truth is that if and when we all decide to do a little something in our own way, that's when massive shifts in a positive direction can happen. But and I think it all the time with this podcast. I'm like, you know what? I am not saving the world single-handedly here. There's nothing grand about what I'm doing, but I feel connected to having these conversations. Like you said, I love it. I love talking to all these different people. It's so interesting to me. I thoroughly enjoy just conversating about this type of stuff. But at the end of the day, I do actually know in my heart that I am doing something to put a little drop in the bucket out there of goodness, and shifting people's attention away from the overwhelm and the negativity to how can we be solution oriented? How can we do our own thing? And every person's story that you hear, probably very similar to your guests, is so different, but also has this common thread of wanting to make a difference, of wanting to do something to take steps in the direction towards positive change on the whole.
Right. And you never know who's listening.
Yes.
You literally never know who's listening, because somebody could be listening that's like, oh, I have $10 million that I just want to donate somewhere.
And I don't know where to donate
and
it.
I don't know where to donate it to. So I'm going to donate it to this organization that Hetal just highlighted. This stuff happens.
Yes, 100%. And it's worth having the conversations, if only for that reason, that something major could come out of it. I also wanted to talk to you about this. The topic of compassion is something that I ask all of my guests about. And I know that it's very clearly a part of what pulls you to what you're doing. Can you tell us what your own definition of compassion is and how it relates to the work that you're doing?
I think my definition of compassion is really just to have patience in what you're doing, and just patience with yourself. Because I think to have compassion for yourself is the first step to actually having compassion for other people. So for me, it was, okay, I'm burned out. I want to do something really good for this world, but what can I do to lead myself in that direction without overwhelming myself, and I had to have a lot of compassion for myself at that stage, because, I was telling myself things like, I'm 30 years old. Why haven't I figured it out yet? And I think a lot of young people feel that way. A lot of young people.
Because there's a lot of pressure to have it all
Right.
figured out.
Right. And for me to take a step back and say, okay, well, my life is redirecting right now. And sometimes that K-turn can be, there can be many different, the K-turn can take like 5 or 6, moves.
Different directions.
Yes. Before it gets into the right direction. And, you've seen that graph where it's like, oh, progress is like.
Yeah, definitely not linear.
And so I really do think that. I think patience and compassion kind of come hand in hand when you're doing things that are, you're trying to move the needle in terms of anything you're doing. Like, and in my case, it's this podcast, which highlights people who are in the social impact space. And I think that that's just the first step.
That is so good. And I've actually never had somebody put it that way, which is why I love asking this question, because everybody answers it differently. But that's so good, because we just heard your whole story,
Yeah.
right? From start to finish, from like the beginning till now. And that is such an important piece of the puzzle for how you've gotten to where you are, and the ability to kind of just sit here very calm and chill, which I will say you have such a chill energy, and I love it.
Oh, nice.
But I know that in those moments when you were in those pinch points where you were stressed to the max, you were overwhelmed, like that probably wasn't the energy you were living in.
Nope.
Right? And I've lived that myself too. I think that I am a much more calm, even-keeled person than I've ever been in my life, but it's because I've worked through a lot of inner stuff. And I've done a whole lot of work, like you were saying, like meditating and introspective work and making
Journaling.
hard choices that are maybe away from what everybody else thinks you should do, or what everybody else is doing.
Right.
And instead making the brave choice to be true to yourself is a very hard choice to make. But I think it ultimately leads you to this like very chill place where you're very assured that no matter what, I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I know that right here, right now, I'm where I'm supposed to be.
And it's my choice.
Yes.
It's coming from me. Like, I made the decision to do this. And it's not a choice that I had made with the pressure of whatever it was at age 18. And then, having to move along that path on autopilot. That's what I felt like.
Isn't
now
that
I
exciting
switched.
now, thinking like what could come in the future now that you're in this very aligned place? Like how exciting that is. And I'm so glad you're talking about this for anybody that's in their 30s, in the same type of, and actually not even just people that are in their 30s. If you're listening in your 40s, you're in your 50s, you're in your 60s, you can at any point choose again, choose differently, listen to yourself more, take a different path. Like, I'm not encouraging anybody to like quit their job today if you don't have a backup plan or you don't have you don't have any stability to do that. But it's okay. You have permission to think differently than you have up until this point. You have permission to think differently than anyone's ever told you should think.
Right.
And that there's just so much value to be found there. And I love that you tied that into compassion. It's just, that was so beautiful. So thank you so much for sharing everything that you did with us today, and just for being so open and honest. I do think that we heal by sharing our stories. We heal ourselves, but we heal other people as well, because you're giving people permission, like I said, to maybe change things up or take a different course or start again. And I just love all the social impact work you're doing and the conversations you're having on the podcast. So as we wrap it up here, tell us all how we can access the podcast, how we can follow along. Where would you like us to go to continue to support your mission?
Yeah. So you can find the podcast Global Health Pursuit anywhere where you listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google.
All the places.
Yeah. So you'll find it there. You can also go to the website, www.globalhealthpursuit.com. That'll, on that website, you'll see everything about the podcast. You can learn a little bit more about me. You can get in contact with me. And yeah, I'm on IG at Hetal.Baman. You can find me on LinkedIn. I love my LinkedIn. That is where we connected.
It's such a